Formation in the seminary is very, very important. And as you all know, it takes quite a long time. A minimum, it takes 7 years. And some people used to ask or wonder why that long. But otherwise, in some areas of formation, it can go as far as 10 to 14 years, depending on each person that have been formed or its student. The question is, why is it too long? And one of the reasons is that in the seminary formation, there are 4 different pillars in which we have to address, or 4 different fundamental aspects in which we have to consider in the process of forming a priest or the seminarian. These different pillars are the intellectual pillar or the intellectual formation. Then we have the human formation. Then we have the pastoral formation, and then the spiritual formation. In this particular episode, I will be focusing more on the human formation. The focus on how we deal with that particular aspect. It actually focuses on the student's maturity, responsibility, and even his moral character. But there are many areas to consider when we talk about the aspect of human formation, because the human being, comes from various backgrounds, like the cultural, family, the upbringing, and each person has his own personality types, and also their experience of past traumatic experience can also affect how they behave, how they react to a situation, and the maturity in which they reach. And therefore, in seminary, we have to consider all these aspects. Particularly in this particular topic, I will focus on the issue of trauma and how it affects or impacts the human formation or human maturity of that individual. And that is to talk about the need to grasp the extent of which trauma can have on a person's moral character, person's maturity and behavior, as well as responsibility. Looking at human formation, in addressing that issue, I will be dealing with regards to trauma. I will talk about it in 3 parts. The first part is for us to explain how the brain actually works. Because when trauma or traumatic events actually occur, they affect the ability to think, ability to feel, and things like that. So the first part in this episode is to look at the basic functions of how the human brain operates. And then the second part of this session or talk, I will look in terms of talking about how trauma impacts that brain. And then the third part is to basically give you some analysis of practical aspects on how we deal with trauma when we come across one or we recognize it in our own personal or particular lives. And so let's go on the first part. The first part, I will give you the basic outline of what the brain, a normal brain, would do in a normal situation, and give you some idea on the normal function, the basic. This is not a neurology class, so I will give you just a basic thing so that it's easy for you to understand what I'm talking about here. So the human brain is basically a cluster of neurons, about 68 billion neurons or so, and each neuron can actually make up to 100,000 new connections every time they learn a new information. And we found this particular organ, the body, in the skull, as you all know. And it is a very delicate organ. It weighs roughly about 1.4 kilogram in its dry weight, But in the brain, it is just very light. It's about 300 grams because it is suspended in between the fluids inside the skull. But the basic part I would like to discuss here is basically the evolutionary process that have made the brain such a unique organ. It has three components, and these three components are very vital for the functioning of the human person as a rational being. So the first part of the human brain is what we call the lower brain. The lower brain, or sometimes we call the reptilian brain. And the second one on top of that lower brain is we have the midbrain, or sometimes we call the mammalian brain. And then the third part is the higher brain, which we often refer to as the human brain. So I'll go through them one by one so that you can see the basic function of these particular aspects or areas of the brain. If you can locate them from the outside, the lower brain would be at the base of the skull. And it is the very part that is connected with the down to the spinal cord. What is the function of the lower brain? The function of the lower brain, its purpose is to do the automatic functions of the body. In other words, it gives the automatic functions, like it is the part that gives us the instinctual responses, like when you want to, things like breathing, your blood pressure. These things you don't control with your mind. They just automatically function. When you want to eat, they just quickly switch on and you can eat. Or you want to go to the loo, defecate, urinate, or even have sex. Those are the ones that drives the instinctual part of the component. And so, as you can see, it's also known as the reptilian brain because that is a brain in which all the animals of the animal kingdom could possess, and they have. Because its basic function is to keep the survival of the organism. And so anything that is due for survival, that organism will operate it in an instinctive kind of mode. It's an automatic mode. And it's very important. It's important because in times of danger, we don't need to think about it. We need to act fast, quick, and sharp because we need survival at stake. And that's why you have the lower brain. It acts on instinct and it makes you react very fast to avoid the danger. And that's the purpose of that particular brain. It helps us to quickly move and do things to avoid the threat of danger that is coming upon our lives and upon the lives of that particular animal. So there you go. That's the lower brain. And then on top of the lower brain, we have the midbrain. The midbrain, if you could locate, it's just right in the middle of your head, you can say. It is basically the area of our brain that is dealing with the emotional aspects and records the memory of pain and pleasure. And therefore, this is the part that makes us build affection into our behavior. It makes us connect with something that we like, that gives us pleasure. And so if you can remember, this particular brain is sometimes called the mammalian brain or the emotional brain. It is the part of the brain that records all your emotions, pain, pleasure. And it functions in a very basic way, not an instinct or automatic way, but it functions by using a reward punishment mechanism in which a good thing is rewarded and it's repeated. A bad experience or a painful experience is seen as punishment and it's avoided, or it's avoided at all costs. And that's how that particular part of the brain sort of thinks or feels. It works by your feeling. So if you can think correctly about it, anything that makes you feel good, you remember it very well. And anything that makes you painful and feels really nasty, you also remember it and try to avoid the memory of it. That is because of the function of that particular brain. That particular part of the brain also deals with the stress component of the system of the brain. And so it's very important to understand this particular function, because sometimes we use the pleasure seeking part of this particular aspect of the brain to actually help us numb the painful ones we have. And therefore, when we have stress in our lives, sometimes people tend to seek to find pleasure to actually relieve those stresses. And so you can remember they can do a lot of things that sometimes can affect them in the long run. For example, drinking alcohol, doing some sort of things that gives pleasure to numb the conscience or numb the feeling of the pain, whether it's psychological or emotional or physical for that matter. And so here we have the second part is called the mammalian brain, or the emotional brain. And that also all other animals have. Other animals possess that same part of the brain. For example, a dog would have the similar response. When you feed the dog all the time, they tend to come to you and make friends with you. Once you chase them, you kill them, they run away from you. They are using a association of pain and punishment, which is located in the midbrain. And so there you go. Those two are the ones in which we share with the animal kingdom, and in which we are much, much like our other animal friends. The third part is called the higher brain. The higher brain is what we also synonymously call the human brain. And that human brain is what only humans have. And that's the thinking brain. It gives you the capacity to rational things, to critique, to analyze, to calculate, to intuit, to judge, to speak, to interpret things, and also to transcend yourself. For example, it is the human beings that can pray. They can transcend their own self into other. And that is important for the higher brain, because that's the component that is deal very much with thinking. And if you can see, if you look at a human anatomy, you can see that the higher brain is the one that is taking the bigger amount of space in the skull. The reason is because it has to sit on top of the lower and the midbrain, because its purpose is to actually rationally guide the two lower instincts of the human person. And that is basically the basic sort of layout of the human brain, if you can say, in a very nutshell and a very simplistic way. I'm trying to make you understand, so that when we come to explain the trauma, it can easy for you to relate how they present and the effect on the human person. So I will summarize it for you in short. The human brain is composed of three layers. The bottom layer, which connects to the spinal cord, is called the lower brain, or the reptilian brain, which actually deals with all the automatic instinctual functions of the human person. And then you have the middle brain, which is sometimes called the mammalian brain, which deals with the feeling of pain and pleasure, and which sometimes we call the emotional brain, and keeps the memory of all the emotions that you experience in life. And then we have the higher brain, which is the thinking brain, that deals with a lot of the rationalization, critique, judgment, moral judgment, speaking, imagination, and even makes you able to pray, because it can transcend to another reality. So until we come again, we will explain to you how trauma affects the brain. So that's basically the normal layout of the basic human brain. Thank you, Thomas.